Hello everyone, welcome to part one of my flipped lesson. Um, Today I'm going to introduce my digital curation, which will provide a helpful um, landing page and will provide a group of resources that you can use to understand the San Francisco Renaissance better and to eventually write your paper. Um, this is just part one, and today I just want to give a broad outline of a few major topics just to sort of lay the groundwork, and I'll use the digital curation to aid me a little bit here. So I am going to cover just a very brief overview of American poetry at the time of the San Francisco Renaissance. Um, then I will briefly discuss um, the extremely important poetry anthology by Donald Allen called The New American Poetry, 1945 to 1960. I will briefly describe what the San Francisco Renaissance really was, who were the major poets associated with the San Francisco Renaissance, and what was their legacy. So to start, American poetry at the time was dominated by um, a couple of very large pre-war figures, many of which you've probably heard of, like T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, and even Robert Frost. And they were divided over the use of forms. Um, they were divided politically, philosophically, but in general, there were fewer schools of thought, schools of poetry um, prior to World War II. Um, but after the war, in what's typically called the post-war period from 1945 to 1960, um, there was an enormous proliferation in the use of poetic forms in ideas, in politics, and philosophy. And keep in mind that this was the time when America sort of became the leading country in the arts world for a long time, um, particularly abstract art, things like that. So thinking about it in that context. And it wasn't that this post-war period didn't have some major figures. Um, for instance, Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop were quite popular even during this time. Um, but there were a lot more poets publishing quite a bit at the time, and it was difficult to keep up and to track the important schools that were developing during this time, um, which is where um, Donald Allen's highly influential, extremely important anthology, The New American Poetry, came in. Um, Donald Allen is a highly respected and revered literary critic and theorist, and in 1960 he compiled an anthology in which he divided up American poetry during this time into its major figures as well as the important, more minor schools of poetry that the reading public, was not necessarily attuned to. Um, and the result was that he introduced people outside of academia, outside of readers who read poetry really closely, very heavily, to really important movements like the Black Mountain Poets, the beat poetry of the time, the New York School, and the San Francisco Renaissance. Um, so that leads obviously to the question, what was the San Francisco Renaissance? I have a page here and lots of good information and resources you can find here. But essentially, the San Francisco Renaissance was a social, artistic, and political movement that arose in the Bay Area in the post-war period. And it was sparked by post-war experimentation in the arts, in the newfound importance of the United States on the world stage, of enormous new wealth all over the country, and also sparked by an earlier and even less known and studied movement called the Berkeley Renaissance, which went on during the 40s, in which some of the major figures of the San Francisco Renaissance were also a part of. Um, but in a nutshell, the San Francisco Renaissance as a movement contributed in large part to creating the San Francisco and the Bay Area that we think of today. That is um, more accepting than much of the country to the LGBTQ community, associated with highly progressive and even radical politics, to countercultural movements and the hippie counterculture. Um, and at the heart of the San Francisco Renaissance of the movement were a group of poets who eventually were called as a school um, the San Francisco Renaissance. So who were these poets? Some of these people you might have heard of before, but many of them I doubt you have. Probably the most widely famous, widely read poet directly associated with the San Francisco Renaissance is Kenneth Rexroth. He was older than most of the poets associated with the movement. He had close relationships with much more famous beat writers that you almost certainly have heard of, like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Um, and he also helped found New Directions, a publishing company, which, if you're an avid reader, you might find that some of the stranger literary books you own very well might have been published by New Directions. It's an extremely um, popular, influential publishing company, especially for sort of off the beaten path fiction. And Kenneth Rexroth, along with Madeline Gleason, sort of established the infrastructure necessary to bring in so many talented radical poets during this time. So together, Kenneth Rexroth and Madeline Gleason are often considered the the founders and driving force behind the San Francisco Renaissance. But then there's all sorts of interesting, wildly talented poets who followed in their wake. For instance, William Everson, who you might also see as Bill Everson, or probably more popular than any of those were his Dominican name, Brother Antoninus, who, from a small cabin outside of Santa Cruz, California, eventually would mentor dozens of young poets later on. Jack Spicer, who was deeply connected to academia, to the San Francisco Renaissance, but was also considered a central figure and founder of his own so-called Spicer Circle, which was yet another poetry movement that formed around North Beach at the same time, but he's often considered a crucial San Francisco Renaissance figure. Robert Duncan, who was a highly talented poet and also kept up relationships with many poets and artists in other movements of the time, specifically the New York poets and also the Black Mountain poets, which you can find more resources about them through this page. But Robert Duncan was a crucially important figure because he brought other schools of thought and schools of poetry into contact with one another during this time. So he was a very important figure in several movements in the post-war period. And then Robin Blazer here and Mike McClure, who were also important poets and playwrights during this time. So generally speaking, the legacy of the San Francisco Renaissance was enormous. They helped popularize new thinking around poetic forms. Essentially, before the post-war period, um, poetic forms, so things like sonnets or limericks or things like that, were not did not completely control the poetry scene, but many American poets tried to constrain their poetry using traditional forms. Well, the poets of the San Francisco Renaissance and other schools at the time really helped explode that notion, and instead brought William Carlos Williams, in particular, who had been writing about these things for nearly 30 years, and 30 years before just about anybody else really was, really helped bring those ideas of freeing poets from forms into the mainstream. The Beats, essentially the San Francisco Renaissance as it faded, a group within the San Francisco Renaissance and poets from outside of it came to San Francisco and created sort of the second generation of the San Francisco Renaissance, which were the Beats, which are you probably know far more about than the San Francisco Renaissance. And just to give an idea of how intimately connected they were, Allen Ginsberg gave one of his first really well-known poetry readings at a San Francisco Renaissance poetry meeting um, during the Renaissance in the early post-war period. So the Beats really owe quite a bit to the San Francisco Renaissance. They also had a lasting impact on these other schools, like the New York School and Black Mountain Poets, which really the major figures of these movements came to become the major figures of American poetry at the time, or at least several of them. So the New York School, for instance, Frank O'Hara, Ron Padgett, John Ashbery, they were all deeply influenced by the ideas that were flowing back and forth between the San Francisco Renaissance, the Beats, the Black Mountain Poets, the New York School, and other Black Mountain poets like Charles Olson, Robert Creeley, and Denise Levertov were also in frequent contact and collaborating and working with each other and the San Francisco Renaissance poets. And finally, the poets at the center of the Renaissance really helped spark the 60s counterculture movement in San Francisco, which has really become an enormously important social movement, social moment in American culture by freeing poetry from traditional forms, by encouraging radical experimentation, and by the political and philosophical ideas and experimentations going on within the San Francisco Renaissance poets and later the Beats. A lot of people really found something compelling to latch onto, especially during the chaos of the Vietnam War of the 60s. So the San Francisco Renaissance definitely also played a part in creating the atmosphere around the Bay Area that was so conducive to hippie culture and radical left-wing counterculture at the time. So with all that being said, the culminating assignment eventually, after we do a little bit more, will be to write a paper, to do a poetry explication, where you will select one poem by one of the poets listed on this site, and you will provide history and biographical information necessary to put the poem in the context of the time, um, and but more importantly, I'd really like you to delve deeply into the language, analyze the poetic forms, um, the specific language used, the experimentations with typography, and the actual layout of the text on the page, and finally to tie that into the themes as you see them developed by the poet. Um, but there is a written assignment and a rubric which will be provided to you so that you'll know exactly what I'm looking for. So this is just part one, but I hope it helps give you sort of a very broad overview of what we're talking about, and I look forward to delving into this topic more. Thank you.